fantasy gamers are having a hard time trying to figure out who they want to trade for, who they want to go after, pick up off the waiver wire, who they want to get to help their fantasy team. Like always on this channel, I like to comb through the numbers, filter, sort the spreadsheets, and see what kind of values we can find. So with this process, what I try to do is find wide receivers who are getting a good amount of workload, but just haven't been producing. Today, I'm going to give you 5 wide receivers who over the last 3 weeks, week 5, 6, and 7, who've seen 200 or more air yards, but have scored less than 11 fantasy points per game in those 3 weeks. And I'm doing 11 because I can't get a big enough sample for 10. And let's go ahead and look at these 5 wide receivers. If you're new to the channel, if this is something you haven't seen from me before, usually I pick 5 guys off the spreadsheet who might be of value due to their recent production for you to make an offer on. These are from the spreadsheet, and I'll read off the numbers to you, and then I'll give you my take going forward from there. So let's look at 5 wide receivers that we could potentially buy in fantasy right now. Another thing though, before I start in though, this is a good tool to use for DFS, especially if you play in tournaments, big tournaments, max entry, or whatever you want to do. This is a good one to find outliers or cheaper wide receivers as throw-in plays for your lineups for DFS if you want to make multiple tournaments. If you're just doing cash games or you just do a couple lineups for fun for tournaments, I don't really advise it. But if you're doing 60, 70, hundreds of lineups, this is probably something you're looking into. A lot of people look into stuff like this or like the air yards report off PFF, which is technically pretty similar to this. You'll find guys who are getting workload that are not producing, so you can catch on the cheap, because if they're in a good matchup, then more than likely they could get the opportunity to produce. But the first wide receiver we're going after today, or talking about, doesn't mean we're going after him, is Darnell Mooney. And we've talked about him before. We talked about him a few times on this channel, and it's the Chicago Bears. There's no secret here. It's the offense. Look at the usage numbers here in the last 3 weeks. 33.8% target share, 23 targets, 312 air yards, 51% share of his team's passing air yards, and a 95.8% route participation rate. You can't really beat that workload. This is equated to 29.3 PPR fantasy points in 3 weeks, 9.8 points per game. He has been a wide receiver 3 or worse in every game this season. He has 2 games this year where he scored double-digit fantasy points. So we are just waiting for him to go boom in one of these games. I look for him as maybe being a cheap outlier for DFS. He's definitely got to be a cheap guy to trade for in some leagues and redraft if you're chasing workload. However, the results haven't been there. Is he a guy I'm really going after? Am I really trading for? Not really, because I feel like the volume's not going to be there enough in the offensive scheme for him to be consistent. However, there have been some plays that if things rolled correctly his way, a couple inches, we'd have a lot more fantasy points, maybe some wide receiver 2 production here and there, and we might be singing a different song. But right now, we're looking at a wide receiver who's getting a lot of opportunity, not a lot of production. There's going to be a game, maybe 2, where that opportunity is going to hit for us. There's going to be a bigger game on the horizon over the course of time. If you have enough games of this type of workload, you're going to eventually produce. The thing is, for a redraft, the thing about putting players like this in your lineup, you just don't know when to do it. And that's the troubling part of that. You want to look at the over-unders. You want to find the ones that are pushing around 50 points on the game to give you a higher implied point total. The thing about it is the Bears are barely in that. So you're just going to have to do your best guess going forward in the lineups. But odds are saying here, the fundamentals are saying if he's getting a 33% target share, getting a large amount of targets per game still, fair amount of air yards, he's eventually going to get his, whether he's connected on a deep pass, maybe something in the end zone, but he's going to get his moment this season. But are you going to be able to start him anyways? The next wide receiver we're going to talk about today is Courtland Sutton. Interesting season this year with the Broncos. Let's ride with Russell Wilson. We're not seeing that happen too much. But right now, In the last 3 games, 21.3% target share, 23 targets, 297 air yards, 27.8% air share, 95.3 route participation rate. Courtland Sutton, historically an air yards guy. He's been one of the tops in the league in air yards before, a few years ago, before he had those injuries. And he's a deep threat. The thing is, this Broncos offense hasn't been super stable. He scored 8.7 fantasy points in his last 2 games. Before, he was averaging 15.44 PPR fantasy points per game. He has 3 wide receiver 2 weeks on the season, so he's not dead. He is useful, and there's going to be down weeks and there's going to be up weeks, especially when you got a guy here that gets deep balls down the field, and that could spike for you. He's a guy that you could catch on the cheap, possibly in trade if you really want him. I'm talking about like maybe one of those scab running backs that you have on your roster that you don't want anymore and you want a wide receiver, or if you want to do a little package of 2 wide receivers you don't want in him, maybe the package up for him or whatever you can do. But Courtland Sutton here, 21.1 points in the last 3 games, 7 points per game, should allow you to catch him at a discount right now. Though he's been getting the workload of a guy who should be producing at least at wide receiver 2 numbers. Just, can you trust the Broncos? Can you expect him to be consistent going forward? The fact that he's getting targets downfield indicates that he's probably going to have a big game or a splash performance here and there. But are you going to trust that? Next guy we're going to talk about is Diontae Johnson. And again, we're seeing guys here, and it's a trend. This is a big trend. We're seeing guys getting large share of the offense, lots of workload, but quarterback play, offensive volume, efficiency, things at play that may not even be the wide receiver's fault that could impact their production. And that's just what happens here. And we got a guy here with Diontae Johnson, 29.1 points in 3 games, 9.7 PPR points per game in the last 3 weeks, but a 25% target share, 30 targets, 283 air yards, a 34.1% share of the air yards, and a 95.7 route participation rate. Also expect George Pickens to start getting some more. These wide receivers for the Steelers are like taking their turns, but he hasn't been super successful this year. He's got 1 game past 10 fantasy points in his last 4 performances. Wide receiver 3 or worse in every game this season, and his best was 15.4 PPR fantasy points, which was in week 3 against the Browns. So the production hasn't been there. The volume here says that something could happen, but he hasn't been consistent. I've had some people talk to me about dropping him. It's hard to drop somebody that's getting this kind of workload, but if you're not getting wide receiver 3 results, I can understand the pain there. But you just got to hold on to him. But this workload might shape up for you. It might not. I'm not saying I'm in love with the guy, but if you want to chase cheap workload, this might be it for you, because 9 fantasy points per game last 3 weeks, 25% target share, pushing 300 air yards, 30 targets in 3 games. It's hard to beat that, and if you can get it free almost, go ahead and get it. Next guy here, and we're going off a guy here that you might be able to get off the waiver wire, Donovan Peoples-Jones. I've heard some people talk about him over the last few weeks, and I look at him more as a DFS play in the future and plus matchups. It's hard to trust some of these wide receivers, but if you want to pick them up, this is an option you might be able to look at. 31.7 points, 10 per game in the last 3 games, 5, 6, and 7, 18.2% target share, 18 targets, 230 air yards, 24.4% air share, and an 88.2% route participation rates. He gets downfield, he gets those explosive plays happening, and he does have some grit to his game. He has 4 games in double-digit scoring, but can he give you enough gusto to go through the ceiling here? For me, when I look at his production profile, when I look at the Browns, when I look at everything together, I see a guy here that I like for DFS, for tournaments, multi-entry tournaments, where you're making a bunch of rosters, and there could be a game down the line where he just randomly hits that you can't project. And the price is going to be so low that you just throw him in a lineup here and there out of your hundreds of lineups and maybe cash in on it if the rest of your lineup's good. Looks like a wide receiver in the right matchups when the over-unders are high that you might be able to get something out of. And the Browns are getting Watson back sooner than later. That could be a spike to his game. Right now, 18.2% target share is something you want from a lot of wide receivers anyways. 230 air yards in 3 games. Pretty solid there. So he's also getting enough workload here to be a stable option. If he's on your waiver wire and you want to think about him or get him, I'm not opposed to it at all. This next wide receiver, Christian Kirk. Interesting prospect here. A guy that was going late in drafts, but he's had some good weeks as well, averaging 10.7 points per game over the last 3 weeks, but a 16.5% target share on 18 targets, 214 air yards, 22.9% share of the air yards, and a 97.5% route participation rate. We've talked about him a good bit this season, and the workload's been there for him. He's had 10 targets last week. 1.5 points against Houston in Week 5 really lowered his scoring total and his average. He'd probably be well over 11 if he had a normal scoring game. That Jacksonville-Houston contest was very atrocious. It was very low scoring, and that impacted a lot of the results. Also against Philly in Week 4, 8.3 fantasy points. But after that, he's been scoring pretty good. 3 wide receiver 2 weeks, 1 wide receiver 1 week. So we are going to get some volatility with him, which should be expected with just about every wide receiver in NFL unless you're a stud. He's not a stud, but he's getting good workload here that can give you some results here. We're already seeing it. 3 wide receiver 2 weeks, 1 wide receiver 1 week. This could be your chance to capture him on the low, considering in the last 3 weeks he's only averaging 10 points per game and 32 points overall, but still getting some decent workload. A 16% target share isn't too sexy, and I wouldn't go after him thinking that he would go off either. I would go after him thinking that you're just getting a stable wide receiver, but that's something you may not want anyways because you can probably catch some of that off the waiver wire for free. But when I look at this whole list here, I'm not super into it, and it really depends how cheap I can get them on trade. I think Diontae Johnson, now that I'm getting some people coming at me saying, hey, can I drop him? Should I drop him? Which the answer is no. Also is an indicator to me that you can get him for dirt cheap or almost free in the trade market, so you may want to kick those tires. Courtland Sutton with the down play or people looking down on Russell Wilson right now could be an indicator that you could catch him on a discount. Darnell Mooney's always going to be on a discount because of the Bears offense. You're always going to catch him for cheap. You're not going to know when to start him though. But if you're hurting and you need a wide receiver with elite workload, not production, elite workload that might be able to get you some points somewhere down the line, maybe him. And it will be almost free. You might be able to pick a guy up off waivers, let him do something a little bit, maybe flip that trade because he's really not doing much. 9.8 points per game last 3 weeks. It's been a rough year for the Bears on offense. A lot of people are down on them, and it really depends on who you're playing with too. If you're playing with Sharks, they may be interested in this workload. You're playing in your casual work league, you're probably going to get a lot of these guys for almost nothing. Some of these guys might even be on your waivers, depending on your league that you're in. But if you're playing with Sharks, you're going to pay a little bit more for some of these guys. If you're in a casual work league, a $20 league that you just jumped in with some guys at work or whatever, you might be able to catch some of these guys on the cheap. Really depends on who you're playing with. That is part of the context here, is a lot of people come to these videos, they're wondering what to do, and it's different for everybody. If you're in an FFPC league and you got some of these guys, you're probably holding on to them. If you're in a league with some family members, some friends, some guys from college, then you might be able to catch some of them on trade and sneak them away on dirt cheap because they haven't been producing. But let me know in the comments below. Remember, these are from the spreadsheet. I didn't handpick these guys. These guys were the top out of like the 12 with 200 air yards or more with 11 or less PPR fantasy points in the last 3 weeks that had the most air yards, from 312 all the way down to 214. And that's how we kind of do this to identify our buy lows at wide receiver. We try to find guys who are getting workload, getting targeted, a large target share, large share of the air yards, and then we see how they've been producing, and we try to guess where they're going to be valued at. This is also a very good method for DFS if you're trying to put together lineups. And say you're putting together 20 lineups for a tournament, 30 lineups, and you're trying to find a cheap option, and you want a cheap option for 3 of them or something. You may want to look at a list like this, pick a couple of these guys, and if they're in a good matchup, you look at their over-under, and it's like a 50 over-under, 48, 49, and you can tell from the spread that their offense is going to be throwing. Then you're going to want to insert that guy in a couple lineups, just see what happens. Sometimes it hits, sometimes it doesn't, but it's a play that you can do because this guy's getting targets, he's getting air yards, and he hasn't been hitting, but now the game script might come his way where if he continues to get this workload, it will hit for them. And that's what we're chasing, is workload that lands in the right opportunities. Look at these guys' schedule going forward, try to find guys getting targets, and if they're in plus matchups, then that could churn out some production. So when we're trading on guys, try to find guys on the cheap. If they've been productive, they're going to be expensive. You're going to have to pay up for them. That's why we're looking for guys who haven't been productive, who hasn't been producing, because they're going to be cheap. We're looking for cheap. We're buying low on these guys. We're not paying high, so they're not going to be super sexy. Darnell Mooney's not sexy. Christian Kirk's not sexy. Diontae Johnson's definitely not sexy anymore. It's just not going to be there. So when you're going for the cheap, remember that. You're looking for cheap players. That's why you're buying low. If they're producing, guess what? They're expensive. Their manager's not going to trade them away for nothing. So they're going to be hard to get. So that's why we're trying to look for guys who have been on the low right now so we can buy them on the cheap off the trade market. But let me know who you're going after on trades in the comments below. Smash that like button on the way out. Helps the video in the algorithm. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. I'm dropping content like this left and right every day, trying to help you out. Just trying to get your wheels turning, give you some ideas. Guys to pick up off waivers, guys to stash, guys to trade for. When news drops, I'm there for you. I'm pretty active on this channel. I want to thank you for watching, and I'll catch you on the next video.